In this episode, we speak with Jason Guss, co-founder and CEO of Octane, a financing platform assisting fast and confident powersports purchases by making financing as easy as cash and creating access through fair credit products. Under Jason's leadership, Octane has raised both debt and equity, amounting to approximately $2.6 billion. Prior to Octane, Jason worked at Capital One in corporate strategy. Since 2014, Octane has partnered with dozens of manufacturers and thousands of powersports dealerships to help drive more sales with their platform. They are backed by Valar Ventures, Contra Venture Partners, RJ Ventures, DreamIt Ventures, FinTech Collective, Third Prime Ventures, and Citi Ventures. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow. Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's a delight to be with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you have hundreds of employees. You've raised, I think, over $300 million in financing. I believe you started this company a couple years out of undergrad. What's unique, I think, is that perhaps you were able to develop an idea for a business from where you were working, which is in the space of lending products. Maybe tell us about the genesis of Octane.
Absolutely. So interestingly, before Octane, I actually had no direct lending experience, although I did work at Capital One, which is a lending business. But the function that I was serving, I was an internal consulting role where we parachute into different lines of businesses and do corporate strategy projects for the various teams. I had worked a lot in auto strategy, and so I was very familiar with how the auto finance market worked. And my future co-founder actually did a rotation in the powersports group: motorcycle, ATV, UTV, personal watercraft, and snowmobile. And while he was there, he discovered that the financing process for these goods operates fairly similarly to the auto finance market, in that consumers purchase a motorcycle through a powersports dealership in the same way you'd purchase a car through a car dealership. Almost all consumers are getting financing at the point of sale through the merchant, just like you would in the auto space. But unlike the auto space, none of the lenders that mattered in the market were on a lender aggregator. And so what would happen is the finance manager would take a consumer application, and instead of being able to get 20, 30 offers they can get in the auto market, they would have to type it in repeatedly through various websites, which was very inefficient and tedious. In fact, when he told me about this problem, I actually didn't believe him. So then I called a bunch of dealerships on the weekend to try to understand, is this a real problem, or is this maybe a handful of dealerships that weren't accessing these software platforms like DealerTrack or Route One, et cetera, that exist in the auto space? And it turns out that he was absolutely right. And so a month later, we left our jobs to build a lender aggregator for the powersports market. And effectively, it was the classic story of, we had the right problem, which was that financing was very inefficient, but our solution didn't work. So we raised $1.5 million of venture funding for this lender aggregator. And within about 5 or 6 weeks of launching that business, we realized the business wasn't going to work. Problem was that none of the lenders had any interest in changing how they were doing business. They weren't interested in automating. They weren't interested in being on an aggregator or anything like that. And so we realized that we'd have to pivot from being an aggregator to using the technology that we had built to power our own originator. Mm-hmm. Because it was still the case that the lending was very backwards and the merchants needed better solutions. But it just was that our solution of lender aggregator wasn't the right one. So we took all of our resources. It was a burn the ships moment, because remember, we were getting enough revenue from the lender aggregator that, we could probably keep moving along, but we would have been fooling ourselves that this was a legitimate business that was going to work. And so it was a burn the ships moment, because as soon as we launch our own lender, the lender aggregator is no longer going to work, because other lenders wouldn't want to be on an aggregator powered by one of their competitors. So we took all the last dollars of venture capital that we had and put it into launching our own lending business, which we did about a year later. So we launched Roadrunner Financial on our platform, and that's really when the business started working.
Interesting. So on the origination front, if you go to your website, it looks like you are trying to go direct to the consumer. Anyone who's interested in a recreational vehicle could go to your site to figure out how they can make that purchase. Is that right?
Yeah. So we have what we call a consumer channel and a dealer channel. About 60% of our applications come from the dealer channel, 40% come from various consumer channels. And what consumer means to us is the consumer is submitting the application as opposed to a finance manager submitting the application. but all of our loans are still closed via a merchant at the point of sale. And so
Hmm.
what we're doing is we're helping the merchants access all sorts of leads that they might not have had otherwise through various touch points. And then at the same time, we're giving the consumer the ability to understand their purchasing power and basically get the transaction done far more smoothly. So in addition to our own website, of course, we have various white label pre-qual experiences that we embed into over 800 dealership websites and manufacturer websites. And then on top of that, we also own various media brands. So we own Cycle World, which is the largest content brand in the motorcycle space. We also own ATV Rider, UTV Driver, and various other media content brands that help consumers find which product that works right for them. They also can read just amazing content on these products. And that also is an area where we're able to get people excited about power sports, and then we can connect them to the right dealership to purchase the vehicle of their dreams.
And one would think, right, if you're sitting within Capital One and you're evaluating this potential opportunity, the first thing you ask is, well, how big is this market anyway? And then how many people would use their credit card to do this and then pay off their credit card? Of course, we can get into the rate differential, but how big is this market?
Yeah, really great question. And this is actually where being a bit naive probably worked in our favor. If you read our initial pitch deck, we thought the entire revenue opportunity from our lender aggregator was between 25 and $50 million if we got 100% of the market. We do over 30 million of revenue a month now. And we are only, high single digits of the market. So we still have quite a bit of room to grow.
Hmm.
It's similar to Uber, where they thought the initial market was maybe $1 billion in revenue, and now they're doing multiple billions in revenue. What ends up happening is you find a market and you're able to expand as you could add more and more value to the space. And that was exactly what happened with us. So when we first started talking to people, people had kind of a similar reaction to you, which is, oh, this market must be tiny. I've never heard of it. I've never engaged in it. One of the problems, most VCs are on the coast. They're usually in urban areas. So they're not necessarily engaging with this. We need to remember a large part of America is not in New York City or San Francisco. They're in all sorts of different other places. And lots of people are using this in all sorts of different areas for all sorts of different purposes. And so annually, the power sports market has almost $30 billion of sales. We also operate in mower, tractor, and trailer, all on the consumer side. So we don't do commercial lending.
Hmm.
That's another $15 billion in sales. And then we expanded into RV and marine. So if you take all of those together, think about $100 billion of annual consumer sales.
Hmm. Now, you probably came up with your own credit methodology so that you could result in a net interest margin that's most beneficial to you, beneficial to the customer. How do you think your method of review differs from someone who does not have expertise in this particular product area?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have three primary ways that we differentiate the business. One of those is superior credit offering. When we entered this market, most people either just did prime lending or they just did subprime lending. We
Mhm.
do full spectrum, we do it all. And in fact, the non-prime market, which is a large part of the consumer base, was just entirely underserved. The products that existed were all extremely expensive. And also, most consumers couldn't access them. So the consumers who could, they're very, very expensive. And then the vast majority of people didn't have answers. And it makes sense because most of the innovation in lending goes to the marquee markets like auto, credit card, mortgage, the huge markets, right? That's where all the investment capital is.
Mhm.
So in a lot of these kind of niche secured markets, you have a lot less innovation, a lot less capital going into the space. So for us, double-edged sword. On the positive side, we face much less competition. On the negative side, much less data because people aren't really doing it. And so when we first got in the market, we had to do a tremendous amount of statistical work to try to find proxies to understand what these loans would perform like.
Mhm.
Now we've originated almost 6 billion since inception. We have a tremendous amount of our own data that
Mhm.
enables us to power these models. But initially, we had to do a tremendous amount of proxy work to come up with our initial credit models, and we had to keep iterating them over time. We're launching the fourth generation of a proprietary model. So we started lending in 2016. This is our fourth generation. Each generation gets better than the previous because you have exponentially more data as your business is growing. But that was a challenge in the beginning. We also had to convince people that this was a good asset class. Most people intuitively think about this market and they think it's risky. They think of a person on a jet ski. They always say jet ski, even though it should be called personal watercraft. And that's also only 4% of the market. But they
Mhm.
always use that example because in their minds, that's the quintessential, this is risky. But when you actually step back and look at who are these consumers? They tend to be people who are living, outside of the most expensive areas, so the cost of living is generally better. These things tend to be their favorite thing in their life, so they're prioritizing this. This is how they get their recreation. Some people might go to bars, some people might go to restaurants or bowling alleys, whatever. These folks are engaging in lakes or going hunting or spending their time in the woods. And so it's the thing that they're doing for recreation, what they do to bond with their family. And then three, it's a discretionary good. So most people, when they think discretionary, think, oh, that means that you're just not going to pay on it. Well, the flip side of it is the mere fact that it's discretionary means that generally people have to have discretionary income in order to afford it. So the demographics of the asset class are skewed upwards. So you remember, credit score, you can have credit scores that are good or bad for all different reasons. It doesn't mean you have high income or low income. There's all different sorts of walks of life that lead you to the credit score that you have. And so a lot of these consumers have, high rates of home ownership, high levels of income, long job tenures. The average monthly payment is between $250 and $300. So it's very affordable. And it's for the thing that they love most in their life. And so once you start putting all of these different pieces together, it starts making a bit more intuitive sense why the asset class performs well. But it's still the same problem that you pointed out earlier, which is, power sports, $30 billion in sales, auto, $1 trillion of sales. And so most people are going to try to attack the $1 trillion opportunity instead of the 30 billion. And because it's a secured lending market, every asset class performs differently. I'll give you an interesting fact. We cover multiple asset classes, even within the power sports space. Our ATV portfolio, which are quads, has the same weighted average FICO as our sports bike portfolio. And the sports bike portfolio has 50% higher losses. And so there are massive amounts of differences within the different asset classes. And so you have to have a bespoke underwriting for each asset class. So then the market becomes even smaller. And so that's why most people tend to focus on the marquee markets where they don't have to do the work to figure out the actual assets. They can just attack that. But for us, it's good because it means that we can actually add value to a market that's underserved who actually needs us, as opposed to being the 5,000th lender in a large market.
So now when we were talking about your iterations of the model, your lending model, have you seen a gradual reduction in loss ratios year after year?
Yeah, so great question. The way people should kind of think about credit is the more non-prime you are from a FICO perspective, meaning the lower your FICO score, the more likely it is that a proprietary score will add alpha. In addition to that, the more obscure your asset class, the more likely it is you'll also get value from proprietary model. So for example, the most common asset class, the most prime with the lowest loss rates is mortgage. If you have an 800 FICO mortgage book, you can have a proprietary model and maybe it gives you 1 basis point, 2 basis points of alpha, but it just doesn't really matter. Most of the proprietary alpha you're going to get is from actual fraud, usually avoiding fraud.
Right.
From a credit perspective, there's just so little loss that you're not going to get that much alpha. However, if you're talking about an unsecured consumer loan to a 600 FICO population, FICO is not very predictive in that space. And therefore having a proprietary model adds a lot of alpha. And so in our segment, the prime space, we've been getting better. We have added a lot of value through our fraud models and stuff like that, but it's just trimming off marginal loss rates. It's really in the non-prime segment, which is about a third of our business, where you see the most alpha, where extra data can actually provide the difference in finding out the people who are going to default versus not. So to give you some math, if you look at our early vintages in the non-prime segment, you would see our losses about 50% reduction between what those vintages look like and where ours are if you were to adjust for various factors.
What it sounds like is that you're playing in a more difficult to discern segment of the overall borrower market, but you're able to create alpha because you can play there and you can offset losses, even though they may be higher than in a mortgage scenario or a traditional product.
That's exactly right. So think about this. Prime mortgage might have the lowest possible loss rate, but it also has the least amount of excess spread. Excess spread means margin that you have, meaning that if your losses move just slightly, you'll get destroyed. Whereas in some of these other markets, you're able to have a little bit more cushion to handle the volatility. Now, you still have to be able to understand the volatility of the asset correctly, and you also need to be able to price it appropriately. But assuming you could do those things, and your models are getting better and better, so you can keep bringing your loss rates down over time, you tend to be able to generate not only more access to consumers who deserve access, but also a better business that's more stable.
Now, with regards to the financing of your company, you mentioned you've raised some early equity financing, but then it looks like you've from then on raised mostly debt financing, which is a good thing for you because you probably did not dilute your equity ownership as much as you would in a traditional venture business. Is that correct?
It's an interesting way of looking at it. I view it slightly differently, which is unfortunately, any business that has a balance sheet is very capital intensive and is very dilutive. So I own much less of the company than if we were building, let's say, a B2B SaaS business. But the flip side is I've also been able to generate far more net income than 99% of the startups that are around. And so I might own less, but our business is much larger than it would be if we were just building a SaaS business. And so we, at basically every single point, the way I kind of look at this philosophically, I've invested in various startups, mostly for fun, because I don't know if I'm any good at it yet. And one of the things I always tell people, like, 'cause I see people who really optimize for least amount of dilution. What you should be optimizing for is de-risking the business and speed.
Mm-hmm.
And so effectively, what I explain to people is these things are pretty binary. It's either the business is going to work and everyone's going to be doing great, or it's going to be a zero. And the vast majority of startups are zero. So you should actually be focused on eliminating the zero as opposed to worrying about if you're getting 15 or 13% dilution on a round. It's just not going to make a difference. And then speed kills. So you want to go as fast as possible. And so at various points in our history, we chose to take in extra equity, not because we had to have it, but because we thought it would de-risk us if the market ended up being worse for whatever reason. And so that explains a lot of the equity we've taken. We've actually been profitable for a very long time. And at any given point, basically since our Series B, could have been profitable without taking additional capital. But additional capital would allow us to run lower levered and therefore safer. And that's why we did it. But how we fund the business, we have a large balance sheet. So we've originated almost 6 billion since inception. We use a combination of warehouse lines, for revolving lines of credits that we get from banks to finance the loans, securitization market where we take pools of loans, we issue bonds against them, so like permanent financing against it, and then also loan sales. So we've completed 14 securitizations, totaling over 4.1 billion in bonds. We have $1 billion of warehouse capacity, and then we've sold about $1 billion of loans. So we use a diversified funding strategy, but by having more equity and also operating profitably, so it generates more equity for us, it allows us to get better terms that lowers our cost of funds, which then gives us more margin that we can return to customers, more places we can be competitive as a business that allows us to serve our merchant manufacturer partners and also consumers better.
As I'm talking to you and you're explaining all these different aspects of the business, I'm kind of like envisioning your 10-year plus journey building this. And it seemed like you were able to kind of figure it out fairly smoothly. Would you say that you have a natural intuition for how to build a company?
That's very kind of you to say, but if you were on the inside, you see all the cracks of all the mistakes that we've made. I think the main thing is we were able to be resilient across the many mistakes that we made. So one is you're never going to get everything right. You're always going to make mistakes. The answer is, can you change course correctly? Can you bounce back from failure? And then lastly, one of the things that we think about a lot is margin of safety. And so we've just always theoretically had a concept of margin of safety that's enabled us to weather these mistakes, many mistakes that we've made as a business, but still be able to go out the other side.
What's one thing that maybe happened during the journey, the entrepreneurial journey, where you think back and say, man, if I only knew that, I would have been able to, prevent like a year's worth of setback or whatever, some kind of helpful advice to another entrepreneur?
Yeah, so for most of our history, we're pretty disciplined on OpEx and all those sort of things. But we drank the Kool-Aid in 21 and 22 where things were really crazy. So basically, we did $22 million of GAAP net income in 2021. And the business was ramping up pretty nicely. And we thought, the markets were really wild back then. We thought like, oh, there might be a chance for us to go public or something else that could be great for the business. And we started growing our OpEx pretty quickly. But then what happened when interest rates started going up, credit normalized, so credit losses went up. Our unit economics got cut by 2/3. Credit markets were pretty shaky, so we weren't sure, whether or not we would be able to sell as many loans as we want to or fund as many loans as we want to. And so that resulted in the largest single failure, in my opinion, that we've gone through as a business, which I have to take accountability as leader. And so I think the lesson that would have undone, I think, a decent amount of pain that we went through at the end of 22 through kind of the end of 23 would have been if we had just stuck to our DNA of being a conservative business. The trade-off is we might grow slightly less fast in crazy times, but the trade-off is we're also more resilient in bad times. I think that would have been very good for us. That would have saved us a lot of time. The other thing is it's easy to get swept up in market euphorias. And so business valuations made absolutely no sense. And so one of the things I think about a lot is we should have thought about over a very long period of time, 10, 20 years, what's the most likely way that we are going to be valued and what's success going to look like, as opposed to in this very short period of time, people are rationally valuing various different things. Like some businesses are trading at like 100 times revenue. That obviously doesn't make any sense. And so I think if we had stuck to that thinking, we would have been able to have our blinders on and not get sucked up into the euphoria. But it is very difficult when everyone all around you is doing all these crazy things and you feel a lot of FOMO. And so that was a great lesson that I think this time around appears to be a little bit frothy again, all the excitement around AI. We're trying to stay very, very disciplined. It might mean we might grow slightly more slowly, but when things eventually revert to the mean, we should be more resilient.
I could see how a large financial institution could find your business pretty attractive. Is that one of the potential exit options that you sell, or do you want to keep building this for the long run?
Yeah, great question. So the goal is always to build it for the long run. We believe that our business is a little strange. We're always in the markets people aren't really thinking about. And so we think the best way for us to generate value for our team and really, be able to unlock our full vision would be to go public eventually. If that ends up not being the cards for us, we still think we can be a great private company and compound for the long run. But we have no plans to sell.
Got it. Before I ask the final two questions, tell us a little bit about how you think about culture.
Absolutely. So I'd say this is actually, to your earlier question about what if you had known you could have avoided some pain. Remember, I was a young founder, and so I didn't really have any management experience. In fact, I had zero management of other people experience. And so I prioritize doing things. So lead by example, less about investing into the various structures that allow you to get leverage as the business gets larger and larger. And one of the things that is a huge failure on my part in the early days of Octane is being intentional about culture was really an afterthought. And it wasn't really until we started feeling growing pain. So usually when you're a small team, under 20 people, maybe under 30 people, everyone's in sync. You could generally be in the same room if you wanted to be, and you don't have any of these communication issues. But as you get to 100 people or between 30 and 100, you start to get these telephone conversations. If you're not intentional about culture, teams can become siloed. You can have stress between teams, that sort of thing. And so a lesson that I wish that we had done was being a bit more intentional. But we have our core values here at Octane. One of the ones I really like is assuming positive intent. And so there are always ways for you to have a faster win in the short term, by being a bit mercenary as opposed to missionary. But over the long run, this is a repeat game where you're working with the same team over and over again, trying to work towards common goals. If you pull one over off your counterparty once, you might have gone to that one goal faster, but then the next time everyone's just going to butt heads and everything's going to move more slowly. And so assuming positive intent, winning as a team, really prioritizing the impact or what we're doing and doing the right thing. These are some of the core values here at Octane that we think enable us to attack these very large problems successfully and be able to win over time, as opposed to pitching short-term battles. We're always working on long-term success.
Excellent. Okay, last two questions. Can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
Absolutely. So there's many, so obviously my family, my wife, all have been massively supportive to me and very, very helpful. On the professional side of things, there's also been lots and lots of mentors across our various, VCs. I've been very fortunate that we've had very strong investors who have been great mentors to me. But going back before that, what gave me the confidence perhaps to be so arrogant to try to start my own thing, I used to just take lecture classes my freshman and sophomore year in college. And then starting junior year, every single class I took was a seminar. And the professors that I had in college really got me out of my shell, enabling me to speak my mind, present cases, argue, all those types of things that I didn't have the confidence beforehand. That I think if I had not done that and not had the fortune of working with those professors, I think I would just be a management consultant somewhere who was very unhappy.
Very good. Last question. Can you tell us about a charity cause or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
Yeah, so Babies to Babies is a phenomenal charity. I actually just had my first child a few months ago.
Congrats.
And so the great work that they're doing to really provide all sorts of basic necessities to folks from lower income households, I find very, very inspiring. My sister also worked kind of in that space before she went to med school. And so I found that really inspiring as well. And so, today that is a charity that I think is absolutely terrific.
Great. And we'll provide a link to that charity in our show notes. Well, Jason, I want to thank you. This has been a great conversation. I appreciate the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me.